I want to take a minute and I want to talk about this idea of variables as it relates to scripting and Playmaker inside Unity. Now, there's this notion of a variable that we can use to keep track of data, information, things like health, score, points, and a whole host of other things. So we're going to start using variables in our mechanics that we build. And this basic idea of a variable, you can think of it as just kind of a container that holds a value of something. And to demonstrate this point, I'm just going to introduce a new cube. Before I do that, though, we have our mock-up of our pickup applied to a cube, and that's working pretty well. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to change the name of this cube, and I'll call it pickup cube. And it contains the state machine that we built for the pickup. So to demonstrate this idea of variables, I'm just going to create another cube, and I'm just going to lift this up in the air just a bit. I'll make it a little bit bigger so it's obvious. Make it 3 by 3 by 3. And we're going to do the same trick that we did when we first started looking at Playmaker, which we're going to cause this this cube to rotate, and maybe we'll even send it off to move as a translate as well. So I'm going to right click and add a state machine to this object. Now I'm not going to bother naming these states because this is just a demo. And I'm going to go into the transform category of the actions browser, and I'm looking for rotate, and I'll double click to add. Now in the previous demo we took the Y angle, and instead of choosing a variable that we have not yet created, I'm going to toggle this button to the right and I'm going to hard code a value in. I'll just type in 90, I'll make sure it runs per second, and I'll hit the play button. And if I look at this cube, it's doing exactly what I expected it to do, which is rotating at a rate of 90 degrees per second in our scene. So let me toggle the play button off and take a closer look at this. Now we can hard code a value in here of 90, but now we're fixed, and that's always going to run at the same rate. In the event that we wanted to change the speed, maybe based on how close we are to the cube, or how many of these little pickup cubes we collect. Maybe if we collect, for each one that we collect, this cube starts to spin faster as an indicator of some kind of gameplay. We can start to play with those kinds of variables. But this idea that we're hard coding something in, we want to start to get away from that idea. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to toggle this button back so that it's looking for a variable. And what we need to do is we need to start to define our own variables. Now I'm going to go to the variables tab, and I want to point out that the way that you create a variable is that you find the new variable field and you type in whatever you want to name it, and then you choose the variable type. And as you can see, there's a lot of different variable types here. And it's really important that we use an appropriate kind of variable for certain fields. As an example, if I go back to the state with the rotate, if I roll my mouse over one of the angle values, you can see that the parameter, the little tooltip that pops up and tells me that the parameter that this is looking for is a float variable. Now, there's different kinds of variables, and I'll define these a little bit later, but just in really short, simple terms, a float value is a floating point value, and that's any kind of number that has a decimal point in it. So when we look at our transform component in our inspector, if we look at the position coordinates of our cube, rotate, or scale, we can type in something like 3.1 or negative 15.076. These are all floating point variables or values. They're not integers. They're not full numbers. And so if I look back down at this list, the difference between a float and an int or an integer is that a floating point can have a decimal point. An integer is just a full point. There's a lot of other variables in here that we'll take a look at. We used the vector3 once before to store some data. We have a bool, which is a simple true and false. We have game objects that we can look to and do certain things with. And then we have strings, which are just strings of text that are intended to be interpreted and read. We'll take a closer look at these kinds of variables later, but I just want to point out that to define a float variable, what we need to do is choose a variable name. And in this case, I'm going to type in rotation speed, and I'm going to use this naming convention. I'm always going to declare a variable with a lowercase to begin with, and then if I have a couple of different words in the description or in the title, I'll use this capital letter to kind of visually break up that that variable declaration, or that variable tag or title, so that I can more easily read this. So I'm saying rotation speed. I'm choosing the variable type of float, and I'm going to hit the add button, or I'll hit the return key. Now we have an active variable that we can use. It's called rotation speed. It's used as 0 times at this point. The type is a float, and if we look down here, since it's selected, we can declare its initial value. I'm going to set its initial value to 10, and I'm going to hit return, and I'm just going to jump back into the state. Now, if before I could hard code a value in as we demonstrated, but now that we have a variable, if I go to the Y angle and I click on this drop down menu, you can see that any variable that's a legal variable, and in this case because it's a float, I can choose that rotation speed variable. Now, as an example, if I go back to variables, I'll deselect the variable that I have here, and I'll do a real simple create a new variable called test, and I'll set this up as a different kind of variable, and I'll just add that to my list of variables that I can use in this state machine. If I go back to my state and I try to add that new test variable, you can see that it does not show up in the list. That means that I cannot use the variable, that test variable that I created for this field. It's not a legal variable. So I can use the rotation speed. Its current value is set to 10, and I'll hit the play button and see what that translates to. So I can look at my cube and I see that it's rotating much more slowly. I'm going to toggle the play button off. I'm going to select my state 1 once again. Now I'm going to go down to the bottom of my state window and I'm going to check this debug, and I'd recommend that you leave this on from here on out. And what that does is that gives you, if there's any data that's being fed into any of these action windows, it's going to give us some output that lets us know what that value is. So in this case, it's telling me that my Y angle is using the rotation speed variable. That value is currently set to 10. Okay, if I go to my variables tab and I select my rotation speed and I type in a value of, let's say, 80, I'll hit return, and now I go back to my state, you can see that that value has changed. So it's still using rotation speed, but it's using whatever the default or starting value of that is. So that's kind of the advantage of using variables, is that they're variable. They change depending on what we put into them. And currently we're just hard coding our values of our variables, but in time we'll set a variable based on what our player character or our user is doing inside our games. So we'll start to influence the variable data. Okay, so I'm gonna hit the play button and I'll look at my cube and I'll see that it's rotating at a different rate. So take a few minutes and familiarize yourself with that process of building a variable and using it in a legal space within Playmaker. Now again, you'll know really quickly if you're allowed to use a specific kind of variable because it'll show up in the list. Now you can confirm what kind of variable you need just by floating over the different options here. You can see if I float over vector, let's see here, there we go. This is specifically looking for a vector 3 variable. So that field will not work with the rotation speed. You can see it's not an option. So while the X angle and the Z angle and so on are available for those floats, others won't be. So, and it'll start to make more sense where we can use what kind of variable once we start to explore the different options that we have. But for now, focus on float variables and apply those to a simple Y angle rotation of a cube. And we'll push this a little bit further and start to translate data or variable data that we start to influence based on what we're picking up inside of our scene. But we'll do that in the next presentation.